very excited to be here to talk about to talk about the drug war and the problems that it's caused and why we need to change it. I grew up in Los Angeles back in the early 70s, experienced the drug war firsthand. A lot of my friends, or a number of them, were in gangs. I saw family members and other people go to prison behind low-level drug distribution and drug use. And so from an early age, I saw the ramifications of our drug laws, and as they're written and as they've gestated and grown over time, how they're inequitably distributed throughout our society and our country. Back in the late 90s, I worked as a detention officer in Prowers County, Colorado, which is in the southeast part of the state, as well as worked on patrol in a small town there. So I was able to see, both from a detention perspective and from being on the streets, what happens to people from getting arrested all the way through, going through the process, and then either being released or being shipped to a state or federal prison. And so members of LEAP were former law enforcement officers, judges, prosecutors, and attorneys that we had a job at one time to uphold our drug laws, to affect what we've been told to in our society, to lock up people that are committing these heinous crimes of distributing marijuana, or in other cases, taking part in areas of the drug war that they're causing major problems. And so at LEAP, we come out and we speak to groups about why we need to change our drug laws. So when I was working in detention, I met a guy named John. John was brought in one night. He was caught crossing the border from Texas, which we weren't very far from the northern state line. We're actually Oklahoma. And so John was in his mid-20s. He was an out-of-work pipe fitter, needed to make some money. A friend of his said, here, if you take 5 pounds of marijuana, take it up through Colorado, and I'm not sure where he was going, you can sell it there and make thousands of dollars. I don't know how much it was. But he was caught. He was pulled over within the state. They found the marijuana, and they brought him into the jail. So I got to know John a little bit. He's a family man. He was mid-20s, a couple kids, young wife. He wasn't somebody that should have been, one, transporting drugs, and two, even though he was caught, it was a circumstantial event. He wasn't causing any undue harm to anybody, and for him, he ended up being in county jail for 9 months and getting convicted of 20 years in state penitentiary. After he left the county, I didn't keep in touch with him, obviously, but I did hear that the next year he was killed in prison. Don't know the circumstances, but he was put in prison for breaking a law that has just created more issues in his family and now for generations to come. And so John, what he illustrates for me and for us is the question of, should he have been put in jail? Should he have been taken out of his position as a father, as a husband, as a bread earner, just because of his one act? Now, he broke the law. We all have laws we have to abide by, and we know that. But in this case, the drug laws are inequitable. One of the biggest issues or problems we have in this country with drugs is Mexican cartels. They've been here in the state for decades, in the country. They're in every state, and they operate with impunity and get caught occasionally. What drives the cartel's business is a drug trade, and they're primarily in heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamine. So what we've seen over the last 40 years since President Nixon started the drug war and started the DEA is that Mexico had become the place that marijuana was distributed from into the US. We're their biggest importer and we're the biggest importer of marijuana. And so we fight and we combat these cartels that are ruthless. They will kill anybody in their way. In the last 8 years, there's been over 200,000 Mexican civilians killed by the cartels throughout the country. 200,000. Over 20,000 a year. Almost 2,000 a month. And these aren't, they went and beat somebody up and threw them in the river. They're decapitating people. They're dismembering people. And it's a warning to others not to cross them. With Colorado and legalizing marijuana, we've seen a significant shift just in the last 2 years with Mexican cartels not producing as much marijuana. Now, the reason is supply and demand. So it used to be historically somewhere around $100 US a farmer could sell a kilo of marijuana. In the last year and a half since legalization has started in Colorado and Washington, now in Oregon and Alaska, that $100 kilogram is now $25. And so Mexican farmers can no longer afford to grow marijuana. And what they're doing is switching to poppy production for the heroin and opium trade. And unfortunately, that's an unintended consequence of legalizing marijuana. But if we go back and look at the cartels or the mob back in alcohol prohibition, they switched from alcohol into gambling and into prostitution and other areas that they could work in with impunity and with very little law enforcement intervention. So also in Mexico, with the shift from marijuana to poppy production, they're also now getting involved in methamphetamine production. Back in 2009, 2010, there were reported to be a couple dozen meth labs that were seized and busted in Mexico. Last year, that was over 260. And it's a high-grade drug that they can ship easily and turn for a huge profit. One of the things that we don't like to admit necessarily or hear is that our government lies to us and they don't tell us all of the truth. And they do things that we, as people, in my opinion, are just egregious. That they take risks that they should never have been able to take. Back in 2011, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives conducted an operation called Fast and Furious. What they did was they took 2,000 registered guns, registered to the ATF, and sold them to the Mexican cartels. They did that as part of what's called gun walking, so they could trace the arms back into the US, so that when they're committed crimes, they can trace those back to the cartel and then use that in an organized crime fashion. Does that make sense to anybody? Absolutely not. Unfortunately, to date, they've only recovered 800 or so guns out of the 2,000. And so what happened to the other 1,200? Back in 2011, during Fast and Furious, one of the agents on the task force, his name was Brian Terry. They were on patrol in a rural part of the US-Mexican border, looking for cartel members and trying to root them out. They were ambushed and Agent Terry was killed. Now that's a tragedy in and of itself. He was killed with a Fast and Furious weapon. Our own government gave the bad guys a weapon that killed one of our own. It's unimaginable. And yet that's what our drug war and our drug laws have created. Looking at heroin and opioid addiction, that is one of the fastest growing segments of drug abuse in our country. We're in the midst of one of the worst heroin epidemics since the 1970s. There are a number of reasons for it. Probably the most important is that it's becoming more readily available. As the cartels go into poppy production and opium production, the price is coming down and the purity's going up. Last weekend in Chicago, there was a bad batch of heroin that was sold. 48 people overdosed and died over a weekend. It's something, heroin abuse and opioid abuse isn't something that we hear a lot of, and you may not hear a lot of in Wyoming being a rural state, but it's estimated that 2 out of every 1,000 people in this country are addicted to heroin and or opiates. And opiates are probably a scarier thing because we keep them in our medicine cabinet. Our children have direct access to it just by opening a door, because we don't necessarily think of our kids are going to take our drugs, or maybe they're friends, but they're there. And we forget that they're there even. And so opiate addiction and addiction to painkillers is probably the most significant drug epidemic that we have. And it's not buying it on the streets. It's in your home. It's your neighbor that had a bad back or surgery, and now they're just stuck on OxyContin. And so it's pervasive, and it touches pretty much every segment of our lives. Last year, there were over 280 million painkiller prescriptions written in the United States, and that's over one per person in the entire country. Another item that the drug wars perpetuated is our prison industrial complex, to where our state and federal officials and those that run private prisons are now in the prison industry to turn a profit, fill the beds, get the people in here, and keep generating. Currently, it costs over almost $30,000 to house one state inmate per year. And in Wyoming, I think there's 2,500 or so inmates. And so if you look at just the cost alone, to house them, feed them, and take care of them, it's a significant cost. When you look at the cost of taking them out of the home, of taking them out of the workforce, of branding a person a felon that will now prohibit them from many jobs and stay with them forever, does a drug war really make sense? Are these things that we want to keep passing down? And what I have to say is no. But the tide's turning. We're winning the war. We're seeing things like the DEA become unfunded or defunded for marijuana prosecutions in states where they have legalized marijuana on some level. When it comes down to the drug war, really the reality is it doesn't work. They're antiquated laws. They need to be reassessed and readdressed so that we can stop the perpetuation of breaking homes and of causing other issues that we don't need to take. We don't need to go that route. I want to thank you again for being here. I appreciate the opportunity. Hopefully it was helpful and valuable. If you have questions afterward, we'd love to talk to you, and thank you again.
You have enough time for questions for about 10 minutes?
You bet. If we have time now, sure.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Thomas?
Do you have any statistics on how much tax would profit versus putting people in prison, a comparison?